Per Aspera ad Astra, the true story of the life and times of AntiChrist rocket scientist John Marvell Whiteside Parsons, also known as Jack Parsons. By now, many of you have seen the flashy TV rendition of the life of John Whiteside Parsons, as interpreted by CBS and tailored to a modern audience. The show, called Strange Angel, is loosely based upon a biography of the same name written by George Pendle. Pendle's work is probably the most detailed exposition on Jack Parsons and the surrounding cast. However, unlike its aptly named predecessor, Sex and Rockets, written by John Carter, Strange Angel does not focus as much on the ritual mechanics of Jack Parsons' occultism. Rather, it takes on a sociological and biographical analysis, which occasionally details some of the famous rocket scientists' religious beliefs and magical exploits. In this talk, I'd like to illuminate the biography, practices, writings, science, and philosophy of Jack Parsons, as well as many of the surrounding individuals who found themselves fictionalized in CBS's account. Born Marvell Whiteside Parsons on October 2, 1914, the man who would be known as Jack Parsons to the world led, like many pioneers, a wonderful and tragic life. His experimentation in science was matched only by his experimentation with the social and political values of his time, his religious aspiration, and his magical arsenal. Before his tragic and explosive death at the young age of 37, Jack Parsons would have changed the course of aviation, space exploration, and forever cemented his place as one of the most curious and iconoclastic magicians of the 20th century. Until recently, Jack Parsons has largely only been recognized publicly by other occultists as one of the many fascinating students of the infamous Aleister Crowley. However, many are surprised to discover that he was also one of the founding scientists of the JPL, or Jet Propulsion Laboratory. It was the JPL that was ultimately responsible for the rockets that have sent countless satellites, space shuttles, and astronauts hurtling into space. In this way, Jack Parsons is indeed one of the great forgers of the modern world. As an occultist, Thelemite, student, and member of Aleister Crowley's magical fraternity, known as Ordo Templi Orientis, Jack Parsons penned many political and occult works. He is known for titles such as Freedom is a Two-Edged Sword, Freedom is a Lonely Star, and Doing Your Will. These have been published in a compilation entitled 3 Essays on Freedom. You could also find some of his occult writing in his work, Magic, Gnosticism, and Witchcraft, Introductory Essays. Before going into detail on Jack's ideas, let us take a biographical tour. As with many great magicians, the life and exploits of such a character would be impossible to detail in a short talk. Even his biographers have only sketched at the major events in his life. I hope to walk you through a few of the most important events that help us understand such a character as Jack Parsons and evaluate the ideas he espoused. 10 months after Parsons' parents moved to Los Angeles, he was born at the Good Samaritan Hospital, October 2, 1914. While legally he was born Marvell Whiteside Parsons, his parents called him Jack. They moved into a house on 2401 Romeo Street, but this happy household would not remain happy for long. George Pendle notes that Marvell Parsons, Jack's father, soon began frequenting prostitutes, and his infidelity ultimately separated Jack's family after only 2.5 years of marriage. Jack's mother, Ruth Parsons, removed Marvell from the home and ultimately from Jack's life. From this point on, Jack would know very little of his father. This would have an enormous impact on Jack, who would write of his separation in extreme emotional despair. Jack would eventually write that this event had been necessary for him to, quote, grow up with a hatred for authority. The divorce, however, induced Jack's affluent grandparents to move Ruth and Jack into the then wealthy suburb of Pasadena. From a financial standpoint, young Jack would be well taken care of. The extended family moved into 537 Orange Grove Avenue, an Italian-style villa sitting on more than an acre of land and a house of 22 rooms. Jack was the only child in the mansion. Jack Parsons grew up an avid reader of historical fiction, mythology, and tales of adventure. This was a passion that would continue throughout his life, and as his involvement in the pulp stories of science fiction grew, it would even earn him the friendship of such sci-fi luminaries as Robert Heinlein. Pendle's biography of Parsons notes what a huge impact stories such as Jules Verne's 1865 classic From the Earth to the Moon had on a young Parsons, who would virtually embody such a story in his life. In many of these stories, rockets themselves played a large part, showing the source of the fantastical beginnings which Jack would one day help to make real. Crude rocketry itself had been used for centuries in military technology, from China and India, in the Napoleonic Wars, or in the War of 1812. But the idea that such devices could be used for travel was, in Jack Parsons' time, laughable. Young Parsons himself had begun working with self-assembly kits and firing them off after the manner of fireworks. Records of Parsons' early formal education are lacking, and Pendle suggests he likely had private tutors, but we see him enrolling at Washington Junior High School at the age of 12. It is suggested he suffered from dyslexia and possibly other learning disorders. It is also suggested that young Parsons was bullied for being effeminate and having the manners of a child of money. He was scolded as a sissy and further withdrew into books. It was during this time that Parsons would meet one of the most influential men in his life, Edward Foreman. Foreman shared with Parsons his struggle with dyslexia, but unlike Parsons, did not have the outsider status. Pendle describes him as tall, good-looking, street-smart, and affable. On a day when Parsons was suffering a particularly brutal beating, Foreman would break it up, saving Parsons and pummeling his abuser. They would become quick friends. Foreman was a farm boy from Missouri, but they easily bonded over a shared love of stories, Martians, and magic. Parsons enjoyed the protection that Foreman provided, and Foreman seemed to love Parsons' wealth of stories and his willingness to adventure. Parsons and Foreman both began to work with primitive rockets together. Foreman's father worked as an engineer, and this gave them access to materials to build rockets. Parsons, for his part, bought the other materials and the plans that were needed. But something else was beginning with Jack, a more sinister desire leading to a more sinister encounter. Jack notes that during this time, using unknown materials, he decided to summon the devil, and according to his notes, he was successful. So successful, in fact, that it scared him witless, and he put the occult down for a decade and returned to rocketry. But as we will see, the devil always returns for his own. Arriving at John Muir High School, Foreman and Parsons were still thick as thieves. But at this point, they had matured the explosive powders they had been working with. Pendle quotes Marjorie Zisk, a fellow student who said, "They were a couple of powder monkeys." Unfortunately, the fun and games were halted when his suffering grades landed him in the Brown Military Academy for Boys. He was forced to attend school 130 miles away in a place where the bullying only got worse. Parsons, however, decided he wouldn't take this on the nose, and accordingly, he made a scene by applying his knowledge of explosives to the latrines of the academy, decimating the bathrooms and earning himself an expulsion. Foreman and Parsons were again united and back on track with their experiments. At this time, many others were also experimenting with rockets, from the Russian Konstantin Tsiolkovsky to American Robert Goddard. It is striking how many of these pioneers were initially inspired by the science fiction of the era. However, almost universally, these men were regarded as loons and hacks, and many of their lives ended tragically. Rocket societies were forming about the globe, a fact that would eventually influence the development of warfare technology during World War II. One such important enthusiast was Wernher von Braun, who Parsons began writing and would call by telephone around 1929. Von Braun, after assisting the Nazis in the development of the V-2 rocket, would later become integral in the development of the American lunar program. He was one among some other 1,600 German scientists, which the U.S. integrated into the scientific community at the conclusion of World War II. However, at this time, they were simply pen pals from different nations, still in high school. How small the world must have seemed from the height of their imaginations before the dark cloud of World War II would roll over the world, and these friends in fantasy and flight find themselves on opposite sides of a world war. Another important event would befall Jack and Foreman, the Wall Street crash of 1929. Quickly, the fortunes of Jack's youth dwindled. A rash of suicides hit the neighborhood, and as Pendle notes, the close-by Colorado Street Bridge became known as Suicide Bridge. By 1931, Jack's formerly wealthy grandfather had died, and Jack and Foreman dropped out of high school. Foreman began a series of odd jobs while Jack was sent to a university school. Jack began to blossom. He was awarded medals for literary excellence, work as an editor on the school paper, and began learning formal chemistry from teachers educated at the California Institute of Technology. However, the harshness of the Depression had set in, and Jack, who had still not graduated from university school, was at 18 forced to seek part-time work with the Hercules Powder Company. It was here that he could really study the nature of a variety of chemical explosives and propellants. Parsons and Foreman continued to work together, with Jack creating the fuels and Foreman forging the casings. Graduating in 1933, Jack had grown far from the young bullied boy. He had grown to 6'1", handsome, charming, smart, confident. He continued reading the classics and had a poetic flair about him. But while hoping to apply this newfound confidence to his professional life, the economic realities made it impossible. However, with some luck, at 18, he landed a job at the Hercules Powder Company and their main explosives plant. The job was dangerous, but paid well enough that eventually he might afford a university education and continued to educate him in the subject of his dreams, rockets. People frequently died on the job, and Parsons frequently suffered the negative health effects of the nitroglycerin. Repeatedly, Parsons received invitations to study chemistry at places like Stanford University, but the choice was between his education or to assist his mother and grandmother. That choice was obvious. Nevertheless, he privately continued his own education and continued working with Foreman on rockets. During this time, also happening in Pasadena, the California Institute of Technology had risen to prominence and began stocking its roster with many of the great names of science. J. Robert Oppenheimer was there, Edwin Hubble, and Caltech received lectures by luminaries such as Max Born and Werner Heisenberg. Pendle notes that, quote, Caltech had become a scientific Athens, and he called it the MIT of the West. To cap this all off, Albert Einstein had stayed at Caltech in the 1930s to avail himself of the discoveries of Edwin Hubble. Parsons himself was actually tutored by many of Caltech's students during this time at university school. This led Parsons in 1935, and at the age of 21, to seek out a man by the name of William Belay at Caltech. William Belay had lectured on the work of Eugene Sanger, who was involved with the Austrian Society for Rocket Technology. This paper discussed the use of rockets in aviation technology. With typical gumption, Foreman and Parsons approached Belay and presented them with their own experiments on rockets and rocket fuel. Belay sent them to a man named Frank Molina, and soon a trinity of rocket science would form that would change the course of destiny for mankind's journey to the stars. At that time, Frank Molina was 2 years Parsons' senior, though perhaps surreptitiously they shared the same birthday of October 2nd. He would become both a pioneer in rocketry and in the world of art. He was also a skilled musician. In 1935, he was a graduate student of Caltech, but he had earned a degree in mechanical engineering from Texas A&M University in 1934. Like Parsons, much of his interest in rockets began with science fiction, with works such as Jules Verne's From the Earth to the Moon. At the time, Molina was working at the Guggenheim Aeronautical Laboratory at the California Institute of Technology, or GALCIT for short. Their passion united. They divided the research duties into 3 parts. Molina provided the much-needed mathematics and theoretical support. Parsons acted as the chemist, and Foreman worked as the general engineer. One of the big challenges was that while rocketry could theoretically reach 1,200 miles per hour, no one had actually constructed such a working rocket. In the U.S., the highest rocket altitude yet achieved was 90 feet, though Russian rockets had hit hundreds of meters. This led to one of the bigger debates between Molina and Parsons, whether to focus on theoretical work or to try to prove their ideas by experimental means. Parsons, having spent his youth building amateur rockets, was naturally more comfortable with the experimental method, while Molina, more at home in a university setting, preferred to establish a theoretical underpinning and to break the problem down into smaller, more reachable goals. After much tension, they finally compromised and began work on a specific impulse engine, whereby they could measure the thrust of a rocket engine. When they first proposed their ideas to Clark Millikan, who was in charge of the wind tunnel, they were shut down immediately. Millikan thought they were kooks and basically suggested that they get a job. So the team turned to the director of GALCIT itself, Theodor von Karman, a Hungarian polymath and mathematical genius. When Karman was approached by these enthusiastic young men, he was seized by their imagination, passion, and especially noted Parsons' innate ability and suspected his unorthodox views might actually be greatly beneficial. He decided that they could work under the auspices of Galsit. They were given permission to use the equipment, even though neither Foreman nor Parsons was a student at Caltech. They became the Galsit Rocket Research Group, and thus officially began the quest of their childhood dreams. By 1935, Jack married a woman by the name of Helen Northrop. She herself had had a difficult childhood, losing her father early and gaining a sexually abusive and excessively controlling stepfather. After this stepfather was convicted of financial fraud, she was forced to drop out of high school and take work as a dressmaker. Her social life largely consisted of activities at the local Baptist church. Upon his proposal to Helen, Jack presented her with a 3-carat diamond ring and a .25 caliber pistol. However, in order for them to buy a home, Jack was forced to take work 500 miles away. The distance would lead Jack into writing increasingly poetic rhapsodies to his wife. It is here we see Jack's interest in the mythical, for he begins describing their love in starlit terms, referencing everything from El Dorado to Valhalla. Pendle even notes that they began a practice to check in with one another. It was a sort of telepathy experiment, a remote viewing or an astral travel. These visions of visiting one another became increasingly intense, meeting each other in mythical landscapes like Avalon. Finally, Jack having earned the requisite money, they were able to move in together in Pasadena on Terrace Drive. However, money was continually a problem for them, especially as Parsons funneled all his spare funds into his rocketry research. Soon Parsons' house would fill with research chemicals, open barrels of gunpowder on the porch, a vat of unstable tetranitromethane in the kitchen. Parsons would frequently take his dismayed bride on rocket adventures with a truck full of dynamite deep into the desert. This type of mad Wild West science and frequent explosions at the lab would eventually earn the Caltech rocket group a nickname, namely the Suicide Squad. With virtually no funding and the group essentially scavenging rocket parts like a DIY project, safety wasn't at the top of the list, especially with Jack spearheading the project's fuel experiments. The debate between the safer solid rocket fuels and the more volatile liquid rocket fuel still raged. However, they finally constructed a working rocket motor that they would debut on Halloween, October 31st, 1936. This was set up at a test site near the aptly named Devil's Gate Dam. The fuel chosen was a mixture of gaseous oxygen and methyl alcohol. The rocket motor would push against a spring, which would in turn measure the amount of thrust produced by the rocket. Their first attempt, however, did not go as planned. The hoses that supplied the methyl alcohol came loose during the test, spraying it everywhere and soaking Parsons. Further, upon ignition, the whole team was greeted by a fiery blast that set them running for cover. Nevertheless, what might have appeared as a stunning defeat actually provided the team with the much-needed information about how fast and at what pressure to combine the fuels, and so, for the rest of the fall, they pushed on. They managed to produce successful enough results to impress Theodore von Karman, and he arranged for them to demonstrate a test launch at Caltech. But this test would also result in a disaster. Further, now working at the Galsit building itself, they had a few embarrassing technical issues that would become infamous. One example was the result of a jammed valve on a canister of nitrogen tetroxide, which spilled over the lawns of Caltech, killing all the grass. These types of shenanigans were not uncommon for the Suicide Squad, now consisting of Parsons, Molina, Foreman, and 2 new additions: Xian Sushen, a Chinese graduate student, and a man named Apollo Smith. One salient feature of this group was that outside of the world of rocketry, they also spent time with each other sharing their other interests, such as poetry, science fiction, and politics. The group were rabid anti-fascists, and according to Pendle, shared socialist tendencies. At the introduction of a man named Sidney Weinbaum, a Ukrainian Jew who had fled the Russian Revolution and who was a member of the American Communist Party, the group began meeting to discuss politics, and in particular the writings of Marx, Lenin, and Trotsky. Pendle notes that Parsons subscribed to the People's Daily World, an openly communist newsletter, and he became a member of the ACLU. The ACLU was at the time labeled by the United States as a communist organization. The meetings became secret, and eventually Weinbaum demanded the group become members of the local Communist Party. Parsons declined. Pendle's analysis of why looms largely around the idea that while Jack was interested in social issues and left-wing politics, he was more interested in the exchange of ideas than he was in joining real communist action, and that he was, quote, more anti-authoritarian than anti-capitalist. Regardless of his refusal, Jack's participation in these meetings would come back to haunt him. During this time, Parsons continued his interest in science fiction, lecturing at Caltech for the Los Angeles chapter of the Science Fiction League. Fascinatingly, while lecturing on rockets for the League, Parsons would come to influence a young writer by the name of Ray Bradbury, who was then 18. This is one of many science fiction writers of fame whom Parsons' legend would eventually come to influence. However, this influence continued to seem like simple science fiction. Their money woes increased, life moved on, and soon the group were all faced to go back and take regular working-class jobs. The project stalled, friends separated, and their heads slowly drifted back beneath the clouds of everyday life. But for Jack Parsons, something titanic awaited him. The devil once called never really leaves, and soon Parsons would awaken his childhood Faustian pact with a chance meeting. Parsons, visiting friend Robert Ripinski, discovered a small black and white book entitled Consom Pax and written by Aleister Crowley. The tome greatly impacted Jack at its first reading and reawakened his poetic and adventurous spirit. Not long after this, two friends of Jack's, John Baxter, a gay man who Pendle suggests had a deep fondness for Jack, and John Baxter's sister, herself a lesbian, whom Pendle again suggests had an interest in Jack's wife Helen, invited them to attend the Gnostic Mass in January of 1939. Intrigued that it was a ritual written by the author of Consom Pax, Parsons agreed to attend. The Gnostic Mass is a Eucharistic ritual, first penned by Aleister Crowley in 1913 when he was traveling in Moscow. Crowley, inspired by the liturgy at St. Basil in Moscow, decided to compose a central private and public rite for his growing initiatory order, Ordo Templi Orientis, or Order of Oriental Templars, or Order of the Temple of the East. This ritual had begun performances by a thelemic group headed by Wilfred T. Smith, Regina Call, and Jane Wolfe in the attic of a Winona Boulevard manor in Hollywood. Regina herself was already infamous, as the Los Angeles Vice Squad had raided a production of Lysistrata in which Regina was an actress. Jane Wolfe was also an actress, and had the distinguishment of having studied directly under Crowley at Cefalù in Italy. Smith had also met Crowley in Canada, and was a prolific student of Crowley's works. While Parsons initially found both intrigue and distaste during his encounter with Wilfred T. Smith, he nevertheless hoped to dive deeper into the works of Aleister Crowley. By 1939, Aleister Crowley had become a tabloid favorite. His infamy had been written about the globe over. He had attained the distinguished title of the wickedest man in the world, and was largely described as a Satanist, a drug fiend, a sex fiend, was accused of performing cannibalism and human sacrifice, as well as being a traitor to the British people. However, the reality, while decidedly different, is no less exciting. Aleister Crowley was born Edward Alexander Crowley in Royal Leamington Spa, Warwickshire, England, on October 12, 1875. The life of Aleister Crowley is so huge that his biography spans volumes, and only a sliver can be treated of here. His life appears wonderful, tragic, and mystifying at turns. A holy prophet to some, and an evil, scandalous devil to others. There is no one easy way to answer the riddle of Aleister Crowley, who became known as the Great Beast 666. But some idea of that riddle is necessary if we are to understand the influence he would come to have over Jack Parsons, and the organizations which Parsons would one day himself be so influential in. The rapid cliff notes are as follows. Crowley begins his youth in a strict fundamentalist sect of Christianity called the Plymouth Brethren. By the time he attends Trinity College at Cambridge in 1895, his distaste for Christianity and his love of poetry combine to produce writings so splendidly vile that they literally lead to his prosecution for obscenity. A good example of this can be found in the pseudonymously published work White Stains. But aside from these blasphemous and satirical poems, Crowley also publishes much classic poetry in the vein of Swinburne and Shelley. There are ample examples of these types of poems in Crowley's 3-volume collected works. During his time at Cambridge, Crowley would largely study philosophy, religion, and English literature. His collected works also contain a variety of essays on ontology, epistemology, theology, and philosophy more generally. A few good examples of these are an essay on ontology in 1902, Science and Buddhism, The Excluded Middle, or The Skeptic Refuted, and his essay Time. Crowley becomes increasingly interested in esotericism and magic, and by 1898 joins a magical fraternity by the name of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. This famous fraternity boasted members such as Bram Stoker and William Butler Yeats. It is here that Crowley lays his foundation for magic. Within this fraternity, he is also introduced to a man named Alan Bennett, who would go on to tutor him in the use of magic, demonology, and the combination of magic and drugs. It is also rumored that it may have been Bennett who suggested the confluence of magic and sex as well. Crowley rises quickly through the ranks of the Golden Dawn, under the direct tutelage of one of its founders, MacGregor Mathers. However, this much angered the lodge in London, as they felt he was an unsavory character. Why at this time did they feel this way? Well, Crowley was squarely bisexual and would have had many, many lovers of all stripes throughout his life. This itself, along with his rather colorful defense of Oscar Wilde, his alter ego as Alice, the name he called himself when he wanted to be a woman, and his liaisons with married men and women, all added to the burgeoning scandal that would be the Victorian-era Aleister Crowley. It would also be the largest influence on his falling out with the Golden Dawn, that and his forceful seizure of the London Lodge, but that is a story for another time. Crowley goes on to become a world-famous mountaineer, performing the first attempt to climb K2 in the Himalayas, a record-breaking 21,000 feet. There is some proof that he worked as a spy for British intelligence. He was decently known as a chess master, a novelist, and a poet. But it is in the world of religion and magic that he really made his mark. He became a prolific writer of occult works, traveling virtually the whole world on innumerable adventures and misadventures, experimenting with sex, drugs, magic, yoga, mysticism, and of course founded his own prophetically derived religion called the Lema. This religion, founded in 1904 after a spiritual experience Crowley and his wife Rose Edith Kelly had in Cairo, Egypt, taught a species of radical spiritual freedom, which would be ushered in by the 20th century. Its central text is the Book of the Law, wherein is the famous dictum, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," among many other mysteries. For Crowley, this thelema, meaning will in Greek, was divine. The center of deity was found in each individual living thing, and their ethic was to discover this divine heritage, this inner divinity, and with true discipline and enlightened understanding, follow it out. For Crowley, this will was no idle whim, but an individual's true inner identity, which was itself God. The first chapter of the Book of the Law speaks to the starry nature of mankind, and no doubt inspired the would-be rocketeer. But the book also warns of a dire time to come, a world bathed in the fires and blood of war, as traditional structures of power are set against one another. Radical freedom, the age of androgyny, the age of the child king, but also the rise of the beast and the scarlet woman, the war god Rahor Kuit. Crowley believed his book to have prophesied both World War I and World War II. Crowley foresaw a world that, for a time, would not be dissimilar to the Vietnam era, a world of free love flower children, and a world where children are napalmed. Within all of this, thelema was going to be the key, a vaccination against the great religions that have held sway over the world, a medicine for a changing mankind. It is this thelema that Parsons would give a large portion of his life to. Crowley enshrined these teachings in a few organizations. One of them, which would so influence Parsons, was the Ordo Templi Orientis. The Ordo Templi Orientis was founded somewhere between 1895 and 1906 by Karl Kellner and Theodor Reuss in Germany. The idea for this organization originally was the foundation of an Academia Masonica by which all the high grades of Freemasonry could be combined into a single rite. Crowley was given a patent by Theodor Reuss to write up degrees for the English section. Crowley did this and formulated the MMM, which constituted the Minerval degree to the 7th degree of OTO. Taking the original rituals, Crowley brought them in harmony with the law of Thelema, which Crowley would eventually do with the whole OTO, when he officially became outer head of the order in 1925. The OTO would also absorb, in 1907, a French Gnostic revival sect founded by Gérard Encausse, Jean Bricard, and Louis Sophron Fouguian, by the name of the Gnostic Catholic Church. In 1908, they would give Royce episcopal consecration and primatial authority in this church. Royce would then become sovereign patriarch and primate of the Gnostic Catholic Church until Crowley's own ascendancy to the OTO and EGC throne. The Gnostic Mass became the central ritual for both these organizations, and it is this ritual which would be Jack Parsons' introduction to the OTO and to Thelema. Los Angeles was, at this time in 1939, overloaded with various cults, spiritualists, spirit photographers, Christian scientists, and theosophists. Parsons and Helen had themselves already traveled to theosophical talks. In that atmosphere, the OTO was not uncommon at all. However, the OTO's reputation as a love cult, which taught sex magic, made it a scandal waiting to happen, and in fact, it would become a frequent investigation for the FBI. Wilfred T. Smith had been given a patent by Crowley to open a branch of OTO in Los Angeles, naming it Agape Lodge. Smith incorporated it as the Church of Thelema in 1934. From Smith's account, they were relatively popular, with 27 or so people attending Mass and up to 150 at their parties. Pendle notes that luminaries such as actor John Carradine, father of actor David Carradine, attended. Also of note, the organist for the Agape Lodge of OTO was Harry Hay, who would become the father of the gay rights movement in the U.S. In fact, Pendle notes that Agape Lodge was particularly attractive to gay members, partially due to Crowley's own known bisexuality, but also because it was a supportive atmosphere at a time when the Vice Squad would raid gay bars in L.A. The rituals at Agape had a strong sex-positive component, which, for many Americans escaping sexual persecution, was attractive at the time. 1939 would mark a year of intense magical studies for Jack and Helen, who would both begin devouring Thelemic literature. Simultaneously, the world was rapidly descending into World War II. Germany had begun invasions all over Europe. Japan was already at war with China. Then, on September 1st, Germany would invade Poland, with France and the United Kingdom declaring war on Germany in return. The world was on fire. It is with this in mind that Theodore von Karman asked Molina to address the National Academy of Sciences Committee on Army Air Corps Research. Molina would travel to Washington, D.C. and show that their research had military applications, but was cautioned to avoid the discussion of rockets, which at this point was still seen as quackery. The military was interested in the potential to assist the rapid takeoff of bombers from tight positions and to get around the difficulties of propeller-based flight. To this, Molina would propose jet propulsors and jet-assisted takeoff. He was successful. The committee granted the Rocket Research Group $1,000 for a proposal that could allow planes to take off with shorter distances and climb faster. The $1,000 was roughly equivalent to $18,000 today, adjusting for inflation. In this way, Jack, Foreman, and Molina could finally get paid for their work, much more than at their current day jobs. Once again, the Suicide Squad would be responsible for innumerable explosions at Caltech, igniting everything from oxygen to ethylene and wreaking havoc on the prestigious university. Nevertheless, by June, they had developed and submitted their proposal to the National Academy of Science. They were awarded $10,000, today's equivalent of roughly $176,000, though they had asked for $100,000, which would have been $1.7 million. The group was more dedicated than ever, with a clear global purpose for their research: to help America defeat the fascists. However, what was needed was a slow or restricted burn fuel for the propulsion, rather than the more volatile liquid fuels. Parsons began working on a host of options, each as frustrating as the last. He consulted with other chemical engineers, but to no avail. While this was happening, Molina's theoretical work showed that a stable reaction was possible if they discovered the proper volume of combustion to nozzle capacity. Despite all this success, the constant explosions and damage to Caltech property finally resulted in the Suicide Squad being evicted from the Caltech grounds. The group was forced to return to the desert, where their first efforts began. Given much of their work was done over the summer, the experience must have been rough, with desert temperatures routinely above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. But even in these harsh conditions, Parsons managed to finally invent his own propellant, composed of potassium nitrate, charcoal, and sulfur, which he used in a super-dense mechanical pack surrounded by blotter paper. This was the invention of the first stable and steady solid propellant. Parsons also had a breakthrough with his liquid fuel. He, at great risk to his own health, managed to combine red fuming nitric acid with a mixture of gasoline, benzene, and linseed oil. By 1940, they would build actual rockets and strap them to real airplanes. During this entire time, Parsons was deepening his work with the OTO. He had sort of come out of the closet with his involvement, even going so far as to invite Molina's wife, Liljan, to some of the Agape Lodge's stranger parties. Pendle quotes Liljan as describing the local OTO in a rather eyes-wide-shut manner. Quote, "It was a huge wooden house, a big, big thing, full of people. Some of them had masks on, some had costumes on. Women were weirdly dressed. It was like walking into a Fellini movie. Women were walking around in diaphanous togas and weird makeup, some dressed like animals, like a costume party." Jack and Helen Parsons both formally initiated into the OTO on February 15, 1941. At this time, Wilfred T. Smith, the master of Agape Lodge at that time, excitedly wrote about Jack to Aleister Crowley himself. Jack began lecturing at the OTO Lodge, and not long after, Helen's half-sister Betty, also known as Sarah Northrop, joined. To get an impression of the type of ideas Jack was espousing, we can turn to his essay, Freedom is a Two-Edged Sword, written in 1946. Here he writes, "Freedom is a two-edged sword, of which one edge is liberty, and the other responsibility. Both edges are exceedingly sharp, and the weapon is not suited to casual, cowardly, or treacherous hands." In his preface, it becomes clear that Parsons became dissatisfied politically, both with communism and with the United States. He rails against McCarthy-era investigations and convicts politicians who hide behind the word liberalism while secretly enacting the policies of tyranny. He writes, quote, "We are one nation, but we are also one world. The soul of the slums looks out at the eyes of Wall Street, and the fate of a Chinese coolie determines the destiny of America. We cannot suppress our brother's liberty without suppressing our own, and we cannot murder our brothers without murdering ourselves." A strong current of classical constitutional libertarianism runs through this essay. But while his thinking is definitively individualistic, it nevertheless constantly reminds the reader of every individual's responsibility to their fellow man. His essay, in many ways, echoes Aleister Crowley's own essay, On Duty, which Jack no doubt read. Jack was also critical of the idea of altruism as an egoless act. For Jack, altruism is always filled with ego, and it often is used as a pretext for some type of compulsion or control. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. But for Jack, this does not detract from the fact that it may be absolutely necessary, even from a completely selfish point of view. To this, Jack writes, "He will realize and accept his inherent selfishness and the inherent selfishness of all men. He will understand living as a technique, the technique of getting what he wants on the terms he wants. Such is the case with freedom. If we abrogate another's freedom to gain our own ends, our own freedom is thereby jeopardized. That is the cost. If we wish to assure our own freedom, we must assure all men's freedom. That is the technique. If a liberal were to develop two personalities, and one of these personalities were to establish a benevolent dictatorship while the other continued his liberal activities, it would only be a matter of time before he killed himself. The restriction of others' freedom is ultimately self-enslavement and suicide. The dictator is the most abject of all slaves." Jack was also weary of the use of the term freedom as a pretext for other forms of oppression. He writes, quote, "Freedom cannot be subject to arbitrary interpretation and misinterpretation. It must plainly include freedom from persecution on moral, political, economic, racial, social, or religious grounds. No man, no group, and no nation has the right to any man's individual freedom. no matter how pure the motive, how great the emergency, how high the principle. Such action is tyranny and is never justified. The question is, are we able to face the consequences of democracy? It is not sufficient that freedom be assured by purely negative means. Freedom is meaningless where its expression is controlled by powerful groups such as the press, the radio, the motion picture industry, churches, politicians, and capitalists. In a further quote, Jack demonstrates that the freedom of his radical thelemic dictum, "Do what thou wilt should be the whole of the law," is first and foremost only possible with self-knowledge, self-critique, and self-discipline. To this he writes, "Freedom, like charity, begins at home. No man is worthy to fight in the cause of freedom unless he has conquered his internal drives. He must learn to control and discipline the disastrous passions that would lead him to folly and ruin. He must conquer inordinate vanity and anger, self-deception, fear, and inhibition. These are the crude ores of his being. He must smelt these ores into the fire of life, forge his own sword, temper it, and sharpen it against the hard abrasive of experience. Only then is he fit to bear arms in the larger battle. There is no substitute for courage, and the victory is to the high-hearted. He will have nothing to do with asceticism or the excesses of weakness. Self-expression will be his watchword, a self-expression tempered keen and strong. First, he must know how to rule himself. Only then can he cope with the economic pressures which are employed by institutions and corporations, or the political pressures employed by demagogues. In the later chapters of Freedom as a Two-Edged Sword, we also see Jack's extremely anti-Christian, increasingly feminist, and pro-revolutionary witchcraft. He writes, quote, "Then came Christianity, an anodyne for slaves, an enteric for barbarians, whose deeds gave them indigestion, and ultimately a whip for slave masters." He also writes this, "The woman was and is the priestess. In her reposes the mystery. She is the mother, brooding yet tender, the lover, at once passionate and aloof, the wife, revered and cherished. She is the witch woman. She stands co-equal with her mate, who is the chieftain, the hunter, the thinker, and the doer. The woman is the priestess, guardian of the mystery, sibyl of the unconscious, and prophetess of dreams. Together they balance each other until the catastrophe of the patriarchal age, archetypified by the monosexual monster, Jehovah." He goes on to say, "Every patriarchal religion is a self-contradictory monstrosity." He then writes of the witch woman, saying, "Woman, woman, where are you? Come back to us again. Forgive even if you cannot forget, and serve once more in our temples. Take us by the hand. Kiss us on the lips and tell us we are not alone. Witch woman, out of the ashes of the stake rise again. It was in the Dianic cult that the old way continued. Those splendid and terrible women, Messalina, Tofana, Lavocine, and Debrivier, raised revenge to a high art. Others sought the forbidden mystery in secret rites and purchased a brief reunion at an awful price. This was the hope in the Maid of Orleans, the dream of hopeless millions that the woman who was to redeem them had come at last. Her failure and her fate teach us that innocence is no protection. Be cunning, O woman, be wise, be subtle, be merciless. I have asked you to understand and forgive, but forget not overmuch. Trust nothing but yourself." He then pens his ode to the woman to come, the one who would one day claim his life in fire. Quote, "Somewhere in the world today, there is a woman for whom the sword is forged. Somewhere there is one who has heard the trumpets of the new age and who will respond. She will respond, this new woman, to the high clamor of those SAR trumpets. She will come as a perilous flame and a devious song, a voice in the judgment halls, a banner before armies. She will come girt with the sword of freedom. Before her, kings and priests will tremble, cities and empires will fall, and she will be called Babylon, the Scarlet Woman. She will be lustful and proud, subtle and deadly, forthright and invincible as a naked blade. Women will respond to her war cry, throwing off their chains. Men will respond to her challenge, forsaking foolish ways. She will shine as the ruddy evening star in the lurid sunset of Gorodammerung. She will shine again as a morning star, woe hen the night has passed, and a new dawn breaks over the garden of Pan. To you, O unknown woman, is the sword of freedom pledged. August 12th. The JATO rockets are attached to the test plane in front of a host of Caltech students and U.S. Air Force observers. It was a rousing success. Their team was granted a further $125,000, equivalent to around $2 million today. The military had definitely converted to true believers. But then the Suicide Squad's old flirtation with communism would come back to haunt them. Due to the sensitive military nature of the project, the FBI had begun investigating the squad and turned up their old relationship to Sidney Weinbaum and the Communist Party. Much worse, another incident surfaced. A man named Paul Seckler, husband of Phyllis Seckler, left an evening ritual or seance, which Pendle alludes possibly involved drugs, with Parsons' own pistol. Paul Seckler then runs down the street to a couple making out in a car. He, at gunpoint, carjacks the couple and goes on a crazed joyride through Hollywood. Upon his return, he is apprehended by the police. Compounding the whole situation, the police come to find out that Parsons had gotten Seckler a night watchman job at the Galset Laboratory. Seckler then served a 2-year sentence at San Quentin. The year ended with a massive change for all Americans. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor is bombed and the United States enters World War II. The militarization of the rocket program becomes ever more important. Further, it was known that Nazi scientists are themselves experimenting with rockets and were ready to weaponize them. Molina comes up with a hypergolic chemical called aniline, and soon they use it in their liquid propellants to great effect. They produced a test with a massive A-20A bomber and sent it literally rocketing into the sky. The Army immediately bought the JATO rockets. The problem was who could produce enough. The scientists couldn't do it alone. While the fuel worked, it was simply too volatile for Navy needs and very difficult to transport, especially in war. Parsons would have to discover another fuel. Further, they needed some much lacking business savvy. With their own money, they founded the Aerojet Engineering Company, but the company just couldn't get any real support. Even after all their success, most of the major aeronautical developers thought rocketry was doomed to fail. Further, the military only wanted solid-state rockets, not liquid, but powder had shown to simply be too weak. At this point, Parsons, entrenched in ancient lore and alchemy, remembered an old legend, that of Greek fire, the same fire that Constantine had used against the Saracens and which could burn even on water. Parsons' solution was this. He mixed roofing tar with potassium perchlorate. He used asphalt instead of black powder. In this way, he created a safe-to-handle and powerful propellant, and it was castable. With this invention, Parsons had created the direct descendant of the rocket fuel used in American space missions, both for ballistic missiles and for the space shuttle. Jack Parsons' invention would send men to the stars, all inspired by an archaic alchemy from the pages of his ancient books. This was Parsons' great spell. Much like Parsons' volatile laboratory, his romantic life was also soon to explode. According to Pendle, the Agape Lodge was saturated with sexuality, and it was not uncommon for couples to swap partners or engage in threesomes and orgies. Parsons began an affair with Betty Helen's young stepsister. Helen herself began seeing Wilford T. Smith. Polyamory was becoming increasingly regular at Agape Lodge, and this caused some consternation to older members. Specifically, Wilford T. Smith's former lover and priestess, Regina Call, who was none too happy with the changes. Helen took over Call's position as priestess. The group then moved the lodge to Millionaires Row in Pasadena, at 1003 Orange Grove Avenue. The house was large and ornate. Further, it had enough rooms that many of the members of the lodge could move in. Thus, Parsons, Betty, Helen, Regina Call, Jane Wolfe, and Wilfred all moved in with a handful of other members. The house was functioning as a commune or monastery, not unlike, though certainly fancier than, Crowley's own Abbey of Thelema, complete with a large vegetable garden, and they had their own small farm of rabbits, chickens, and goats. It wasn't long before the members had children, and the house filled up. There were reports of the typical roommate battles and squabbles. Parson gives his entire salary to the support of the household, minus a measly $10 a month, which would be around $200 today. The lodge grew in membership rapidly and eventually included his rocket mate, Ed Foreman, and his wife. Many of Jack's old friends began to join. According to Pendle, the sexual atmosphere only increased, with sex and sexual magic between couples pairing off like a medieval dance. Pendle details the following episode. The Agape Lodge invites an enormous number of unaffiliated individuals to a grand OTO party. Many of these are work friends and people Jack had to work with professionally. This party, apparently quite wild, resulted in two things. 1. Guests, whether members or not of OTO, all gathered to dance naked and drunk about the outdoor lodge fountain. 2. A visit from the FBI, who were investigating the lodge for sex perversion. Parsons initially managed to put off the FBI by telling them they were a philosophical and religious group, but the FBI would return again and again. Parsons himself received a 200-page FBI investigation file. The atmosphere at the lodge was perhaps getting out of control. Parsons himself was a heavy drinker and had, according to Pendle, began using cocaine and amphetamines to deal with his work stress. Parsons is known for this short poem fragment illustrating his thoughts at the time. I hight Don Quixote. I live on peyote, marijuana, morphine, and cocaine. I never knew sadness, but only a madness that burns at the heart and the brain. All this behavior eventually made its way to Crowley's main American representative, Karl Germer, a very serious man who narrowly survived a concentration camp at the hands of Nazi Germany. The last thing he wanted to see was the OTO he loved degenerate into a simple sex and drugs cult. For Germer, the blame rested on the bad influence of Wilfred T. Smith rather than Parsons, and he communicated as much to Crowley. Crowley, no stranger to drugs himself, nevertheless ordered Wilfred T. Smith to step down as master of Agape Lodge. Parsons and Helen both tried to convince Crowley that Smith wasn't really all that bad and that things had been greatly exaggerated. Unfortunately, the plethora of drug poetry published by Smith and Parsons convinced him otherwise. Smith was removed, Parsons chided and strapped with the responsibilities of leadership. Not long after, Smith would father a child with Helen Parsons. Helen and Betty continued to fight, no doubt in large part to Betty and Parsons' own affair. Smith took a magical retirement at the suggestion of Crowley, and took Helen and their new child with them to an OTO member's turkey farm. Parsons, distraught, attempted to resign from leadership, but Crowley managed to convince him that his service was far too valuable. It was at this time in 1942 that Parsons would become friends with Robert Heinlein, author of Starship Troopers and Stranger in a Strange Land. They would, of course, bond over a mutual love for science fiction, and Parsons' influence can be seen in some of his works, like The Devil Makes the Law. It was also at this time that Germany began bombarding England with its own V-2 rockets, and this convinced the U.S. to once again invest in rocket technology. From this investment, with Molina as head, in 1943 the Jet Propulsion Laboratory was born. But in this, Parsons would be a strange fit. He became known for his obvious affairs with secretaries, and would openly chant Crowley invocations, such as the hymn to Pan, in the halls of Aerojet and the JPL. Perhaps because of this, when the General Tire and Rubber Company bought a majority share in Aerojet, they included a provision that they would only do so if Parsons and Foreman were forced to sell their shares. Aerojet is today a multi-million-dollar company. Pendle notes that had Parsons not been forced out, his shares would be worth $12 million today. However, Parsons took the little money he did make off his shares and bought the lodge at 1003 Orange Grove. He and Foreman then went on to found the Astra Engineering Company. During this time, on May 8, 1945, Germany unconditionally surrenders. Further, Regina Kahl dies. The lodge had dwindled to a few members, and many, tired of living in a party house, moved out. Parsons filled their vacancies with his science fiction friends and engineers, who were more than happy to move into such an environment. In fact, Jack and Betty put out a call for roommates, such as, quote, bohemians, artists, musicians, atheists, and anarchists. The house became filled with occultists and nuclear scientists. At one point, 20 people were living in the mansion. Parsons was head over heels in love with Betty, but much to many members' consternation, Betty was increasingly focused on a party life and not on OTO ritual. Then, surprisingly, Wilfred Smith returned along with Helen. This did not make matters any better. The house continued to be a hub for science fiction aficionados, and well-known writers like Heinlein would frequently stop by. Perhaps because of this, or because of the radical adverts for roommates put out by Betty and Parsons, the house attracted the attention of one L. Ron Hubbard. L. Ron Hubbard, the future founder of the cult Scientology, was at the time a published science fiction writer and had met Parsons at Heinlein's Literary Society. Hubbard was full of stories and exaggerations and fresh out of a naval career. He would tell stories of his adventures at sea and go so far as to claim to have lassoed a polar bear in the North Atlantic and having been attacked by Aborigines on an expedition. Reactions to Hubbard at the lodge were mixed. Some people delighted to hear his stories, while others felt he was a slimy phony who knew how to spin a yarn. Parsons began describing Crowley's ideas to Hubbard and seemed encouraged that Hubbard caught on so quickly. Hubbard moved into the lodge and was soon able to convince Parsons that he knew an extraordinary amount about magic. Pendle notes that the two would take up fencing together and would frequently be found hanging out with Robert Heinlein. The young Hubbard also began making the moves on the women of the commune and was apparently very successful at his brand of seduction. It would not be long before Hubbard would successfully make moves on Betty. Although Betty had many sexual partners while she and Jack were together, her relationship with Hubbard deeply disturbed Jack. While Jack tried to contain his jealousy, he could tell that Betty was falling in love with Hubbard, and it would not be long before she would leave Jack's side entirely. Pendle notes that soon Hubbard made a show making out with Betty in front of him, and hostilities quickly ensued. Perhaps as a distraction, Parsons turned ever fiercer into his practice of magic. From his journal, we can see him heavily involved in Enochian elemental and planetary angel magic. He also began using Crowley's preliminary invocation of the Goetia. But they seemed to be doing things different than the typical thelemic rituals, and in one account, Ed Foreman, not really a believer in the physical reality of magic, had a startling experience after a series of rituals Jack and him performed. The house began to shake, and a host of entities, likened to banshees, appeared floating about the windows. Ed Foreman freaked and tried to see if anyone else saw them, but they did not. He would be disturbed by this manifestation for the rest of his life. Describing Jack's magical techniques, Pendle says that he began charging statues with vital force, that he had begun studying witchcraft, voodoo, and the Humfort, which is a term for a voodoo temple. The whole OTO became concerned that Jack had summoned something disturbing into the house, something demonic and shadowy, and these presences were being reported by all of the members. Some of the residents snuck into his room at night to get an idea of the type of magic he was working, and without a doubt, as Alvar Rogers described, they were looking at, quote, an uninvited glimpse into the blackest and most secret center of a tortured man's soul. According to Parsons' record, he was trying to conjure a new magical mate using Dr. John Dee's 16th century form of magic, known as Enochian. Crowley had himself used Dr. Dee's Enochian magic in Algeria, where he produced a series of visions that would come to be known as the Vision and the Voice. Dr. John Dee was the court astrologer to Elizabeth I, and he believed he had received not only the original Adamic and angelic language, but also an entire system of magic designed to communicate and conjure angels and elementals. Parsons would attempt to use this magic to incarnate, in human female form, a powerful elemental spirit which would be his partner in crime. We can see from letters exchanged between Parsons and Crowley that Parsons had been given access to secret OTO 8th degree documents which dealt with sexual magic. Parsons claimed to have created new orders of being using this technique, to consecrate living talismans to aid his work, and to have involved the elemental sub-angles of the Enochian watchtowers. He was apparently working what would later become known as Enochian sex magic. According to his journal, the magic began to disturb the weather. Poltergeist phenomena began to manifest in raps and knocks. Regardless, Parsons continues the rituals, only to have L. Ron Hubbard attacked by an unseen assailant, leaving his arm paralyzed. a yellow orbish entity appears in the kitchen. Since Hubbard experienced the entity, Jack invites him to join in the rituals. Hubbard and Parsons would eventually travel to the Mojave Desert together, performing a series of workings aimed at incarnating this magical woman. This working would come to be known as the Babylon working. On January 18, 1946, Parsons, with the realization that all was finished, returned home to discover one Marjorie Cameron waiting for him. Cameron was an abnormal character. She was from Bella Plain, Iowa, and a train-hopping adventurer in her youth, but enlisted in the U.S. Navy during World War II, serving in the map room in D.C. However, she went AWOL and went to find her family in Pasadena. Cameron was also an artist and recently had received much renown. In fact, the Cameron Parsons Foundation was established in 2006 to preserve her acclaimed works. Today, her paintings have been exhibited from Paris to New York and LA. Currently, her contribution to the world of art continues to be an object of fascination. You can find a retrospective of her work, which was held at the Deitch Projects in Soho and entitled Cameron, Cinderella of the Wastelands. You can even see the obvious face of Jack Parsons in some of her work. The Huffington Post describes her work as Crowley's occult with the surrealism and symbolism of French poets, yielding dark yet whimsical depictions buzzing with otherworldly power. In her early acting career, Cameron would appear with Dennis Hopper in the movie Night Tide. She is perhaps most well known, outside of her painting, for her appearances in the films of fellow Thelemite Kenneth Anger, such as Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome. Later in life, she would also appear, along with her art, in the short film The Wormwood Star, directed by herself and Curtis Harrington. She would go on to found her own sex magical order called The Children in Beaumont, California, where the aim was to intentionally produce mixed-race moon children who would be devoted to the god Horus. Eventually, she would make friends both with the modern head of the OTO, Hymenaeus Beta, and Genesis P-Orridge. Her life, like Jack's, is also worthy of an entire biography, and it is unfortunate I cannot go into it here. She died of cancer in 1995. Returning to her life with Jack, not long after her arrival, Cameron and Jack began their own series of sex magic rituals. Parsons even constructed a special talisman for her to wear, which she did until many years later when it was confiscated by police because it contained a virulent poison. Parsons dubbed her the Witch Woman and began composing poetry to her. Continuing Hubbard and Parsons' Babylon working, this new stage was designed to incarnate Babylon herself as the Scarlet Woman. For Crowley's part, analyzing Parsons' record, he was concerned that Jack jumped to conclusions about his work too fast and exaggerated the importance of his first magical attainments. Grady McMurtry, the future head of the OTO, would also note that Jack's magical experiments were too unorthodox to really be ninth-degree OTO sex magic. But this warning would not deter Jack, who would only go at his experiments harder. He was as reckless with magic as he was with rockets. But in both these cases, he nevertheless produced results. Cameron was already pregnant by Parsons. Jack returns to the desert, and from that work pens the Book of Babylon as a received prophetic text, in which the voice of Babylon herself is present. He entitles it Liber 49, which also contains within it the Book of Babylon. This book, among Orthodox Thelemites, is of course controversial, especially since it claims to be the fourth chapter of the tripart text received by Crowley, namely the Book of the Law. Pendel's biography of Parsons is much less interested in the mechanics of these magical workings, but John Carter's work, Sex and Rockets, The Occult World of Jack Parsons, goes into great detail. In one initial working between Cameron and Parsons, dated March 1, 1946, Parsons prepared the altar according to the instructions given in the Book of Babylon. It is of obvious Venusian character, with sandalwood incense, a green and gold altar cloth, the Book of Babylon upon the altar in gold and blue, anointed with the magically charged sexual fluids of both Parsons and Cameron. On March 2nd, Hubbard returns after an extended leave to the VA and acts as a scryer for Parsons. This ritual, set to a soundtrack of Rachmaninoff's Isle of the Dead and began at 8 p.m., resulted in an astral vision of Babylon and the beast of the biblical book of Revelation. A few excerpts spoken by L. Ron Hubbard to Parsons. Quote, "The angel of Tarot, A 3-day retirement to greet her. Purify thyself. The symbol is 7 by 3. It is Babylon. Keep secret. The communications are secret. These are the preparations. Green gold cloth for the beast, upon a hidden platter, back of the altar. Disrobe only when the doors are bolted. Transgression is death. And also this. The year of Babylon is 4063. Beware the use of profaned rituals. She is beautiful. Horrible. Parsons is then told to make a box of blackness covered in fire and his own blood. He is then given a detailed set of instructions which allude to the appearance of her in a physical body. He is given permission to ask only 3 questions of her, and then he must take the alkahest, an alchemical term for the philosopher's stone, by mouth. He is to avoid human contact and begin dedicating his mind, heart, and genitals to her. Parsons does all these things. Then, through their own Babylon invocations, including the Golden Dawn hexagram ritual, the 7th Enochian key, excerpts from the Mass, the vision and the voice, Parsons and Cameron complete the ritual. Then the roof of their guest house goes up in flames. Again, undeterred, the visions continue with Hubbard as scribe for the next few days. Parsons, now armed with the Book of Babylon and seeing himself as prophet, and Cameron as an incarnation of Babylon, excitedly writes to Aleister Crowley, who was less than enthused. Crowley's concern seems to be that in Parsons' work with Hubbard, he does not seem to at any point really test the spirits to determine they are who they say they are, but he takes everything on faith. Further, he is concerned that what Parsons has invoked was a mere elemental whom he has fallen in love with, citing magician Eliphas Levi's warning that magicians often fall prey to the love of elementals. Crowley further reminds Parsons of his oath to elevate mankind, and that all his work should be directed to that end and not to self-aggrandizing attainments. He further warns him to be less trusting of people, and that Parsons' sensitivity and poeticism is perhaps getting the best of him. Well, Parsons disagreed, and formally resigned as head of Agape Lodge, placing his friend Roy Leffingwell in charge. Crowley then writes to Carl Germer, head of the USOTO, saying, "Apparently he or Hubbard or somebody is producing a moonchild. I get fairly frantic when I contemplate the idiocy of these goats." According to Carter, 9 years later, Cameron would claim that she herself was indeed the incarnation of Babylon drawn down by these rituals. Despite all this excitement, or perhaps because of it, Hubbard would begin a coup of his own, though with much less magical intent. Hubbard convinced Parsons to start a business with him and Betty. The idea was to pool their resources and whatever profits into a company called Allied Enterprises. Parsons invested his entire life savings of $20,970. Hubbard, however, only managed to put together $1,183. Betty gave nothing. Pendle seems to believe that while Parsons was excited by Cameron, he was still deeply in love with Betty and hoped this would bring them closer. Unfortunately, he couldn't have been more wrong. Hubbard suggested that Betty and him travel to Miami for a deal in yachts, which would allow them to sail them and sell them for a much higher price on the West Coast. Most of Parsons' OTO friends tried to discourage Parsons, but Betty's argument still held much higher value. Hubbard then set out with Betty on a world cruise, and not a business venture. When Parsons had not heard from either Betty or Hubbard in weeks, he became worried. But Hubbard quickly called him from Miami, reassuring him that all was well. Lewis Culling would appraise Crowley of the situation, who quickly sent a cable. "Suspect Ron of playing a confidence trick. Jack Parsons a weak fool. Obvious victim prowling swindlers." Hearing this from Crowley, Parsons wised up and flew out to Miami and checked into a motel. Hubbard and Betty had purchased 3 yachts. They hear of Parsons' presence in Miami. They set sail. Parsons decided to perform the invocation of the spirit of Mars, known as Bartzabel, to avenge the slight. Hubbard and Betty's ship are hit by a squall off the coast of Florida, destroying the sails, and are forced back to port to find Parsons waiting for them at the dock. Parsons settles in court for a measly $2,900. Betty and Hubbard marry. Parsons returns to Pasadena to find the remaining OTO has moved out from his home. He resigns formally from the OTO and sells the old house, and then the new owners demolish it. In May 1950, Hubbard publishes Dianetics and begins his journey in the founding of Scientology, now with over 8 million members across the globe. Hubbard would later go on to claim that he'd been sent by the U.S. Navy to break up the satanic cult led by Parsons, and that he rescued Betty from its clutches. Parsons returned to work in the professional world, working for the North American Aviation Company in Los Angeles. Cameron and Parsons maintained an open marriage, with Cameron working on her painting and studying the occult with Jack, who spent much of his time writing rapturous poetry about her. The couple moved to Manhattan Beach, and Parsons would lecture on rocketry and its possibilities in the nuclear age. Cameron was preparing to begin art school in Paris, and Parsons, after having left the OTO for over a year, began writing Crowley with the hopes of rebuilding his position and prestige once again. But on December 1st, 1947, Aleister Crowley dies. Parsons would try and shore up his professional qualifications by enrolling in night courses at the University of Southern California. But before he could graduate, the FBI stripped him of his security clearance, causing him to lose his job. His days studying communism had come back to haunt him under the specter of the Red Scare. Cameron then decides to leave Jack for an artist's colony in Mexico, and Jack was reduced to pumping gas at a local station. In this abject state, Parsons swears the infamous Oath of the Abyss. He descends in a self-described state of madness and horror. Pendle notes he even thought of killing himself. Again, his self-descriptions turn manically grandiose, and he declares himself the AntiChrist, come to ready the way for Babylon the Great. He writes his manifesto of the Antichrist. Luckily for Parsons, no one read it. He manages to get his security clearance reinstated at Hughes Aircraft Company in Culver City. However, the FBI would continue to hound him about his relationship to the Communist Party. Arrests of his old friends and scientists were becoming commonplace as the McCarthy era took hold. Parsons realized his own days were probably numbered and began making plans to move to Israel. But all of this was ill-fated. He would again be fired from his job, stripped of his clearance, and subject to continual surveillance. Parsons would not be moving anywhere. Cameron heard of Parsons' troubles and, in a sympathetic move, abandoned her divorce of him and returned to L.A. They move in together, and Parsons once again starts his own chemical company. The couple's bohemian parties begin again, and with many distinguished artists and musicians visiting, it seems happy. The police would be a constant presence, though, and Parsons was awaiting a possible espionage charge. It was during this era that Parsons began his own writings on witchcraft and had hoped to move Cameron and himself to Mexico and start a fireworks company. Parsons had recently been forced to move many of his research chemicals to his home coach house, strangely the same space he kept his magical black box for the Babylon working. Cameron and Jack had planned to leave for Mexico on June 17th, but he received a curious last-minute call from a special effects corporation asking if he would prepare some last effects. Then, at 5:08 on June 17th, 1952, an explosion would take place in Jack's laboratory, blowing off the left side of his body, leaving half his skeleton visible. The area is a smattering of chemical equations and magical sigils. After a few blood-gurgling moans, Jack Parsons is dead. Reporters flock to the scene to cover the strange sight. Marjorie Cameron returns from shopping for their trip to Mexico to discover her husband, age 37, was dead, consumed by fire. Jack's mother, Ruth Parsons, upon hearing the news, swallows a bottle of Nebutol and kills herself in front of her friends just 4 hours after Jack's death. The story of who Jack really was hits the paper, and his life cements into legend. Many friends begin to suggest that it was foul play, that Jack had been assassinated, but the police decide his death is an accident and immediately close the case. Jack Parsons was not given a funeral. However, the OTO in LA held a ceremony to honor his passing, and curiously, Betty, who had recently divorced Parsons, attended the OTO ceremony. Cameron would take Jack's ashes into the desert, where so much of his life's work was accomplished, and scatter his ashes at the site of his infamous Babylon working. He had been consumed in flame, just as the working predicted. But in the aftermath, his partner Melina would go on to see their rockets reach space. Aerojet would become central in the liftoff of the Apollo space missions. On Halloween of 1968, the JPL would commemorate the 32nd anniversary of the first rocket experiments. At this event, Frank Melina would end his speech saying, "In conclusion, I would like to pay homage to Jack Parsons, who made key contributions to the development of storable propellants and of long-duration solid propellant engines that play such an important role in American and European space technology. He has not received as yet his due for his pioneering work." It is appropriate, then, that in 1972, the International Astronomical Union named a crater for Jack on the dark side of the moon. With this, Jack finally accomplished his childhood motto, "Through hardship to the stars."